Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. The rest of my house is not looking so great right now, which is why I keep filming in this not great lighting situation on my living room floor. I've not been well lately. If you are interested in why, I will leave a video talks about what I've been going through at the moment in the cards above. But today I'm just going to talk to you about the 10 books that Booktube has made me read that I have loved the most. So I have been watching Booktube for a lot longer than I've been making Booktube videos, so some of these will have been on my list for a very long time, and I will try my best to remember which booktubers recommended them and made me want to read them. We've got poetry, we've got literary fiction, historical fiction, non-fiction, all of my usual genres. So without further ado, let's jump into the books. The first one on the list, this is going in like reverse chronological order of how I read them. So the first one on the list is Honorifics by Cynthia Miller, which is a collection of poetry and is the best collection of poetry and the best book I've read so far this year. It's the only book that I've read in 2022 to which I have given 5 stars, and I have read 55 books at this point. So I've read quite a lot of books, and this is the only one that's impressed me enough to give 5 stars. This is a collection of poetry about place and family and belonging and being a child of a third culture or a child of immigrants, where you feel a connection to your home culture but you are also alienated from it because you are othered in both places as being, I think in this case, American-born Chinese, and her family being straight Chinese. So she feels a connection to them, that culture, but she can't quite break in, and it's about family and those connections, and I just absolutely loved it. I've been trying to read more poetry this year, and I've been wondering whether I'm just not smart enough, because a lot of the poetry collections I've been reading I've found obtuse and difficult to connect with, but this poetry collection wasn't like that at all. It was really well done, and I know that there's other sort of poetry collections that are very accessible, but I don't like, because they're not like, they don't seem to be doing enough with language for my personal taste. But I think that Cynthia Miller has that balance very perfectly done for me, where the language is simple enough for me to understand what the metaphors are, what she's saying. There are still so many layers to it and so much done with language. I think that I first saw this on Jen Campbell's channel, which is where I get a lot of poetry recommendations, and although our poetry taste does not 100% line up, it did in this case, so I'm very glad that she recommended it. Next I have The Vegetarian by Han Kang, and I read this when I was reading books from Korea for the Koreadathon, which I will leave a vlog about linked in the cards above. But this is one of those books that's been on my TBR for a very long time because I've heard so many people talk about it and love it. Again, I think Jen Campbell, also Jean from Jean's Bookish Thoughts, I think has read this and liked this, although I know Mercedes from Mercy's Bookish Readings DNF'd it part way through, so I know it's not for everyone. This is about a woman who, after a dream, gives up eating meat, but we never really see it from her perspective. It's from the perspective of other people in her lives, including her partner, and the kind of abuse that she's going through at his hand. And it's about gender and family and expectations and trying to live up to expectations, and she is also sort of, her giving up meat is not like a reasoned decision that she wants to give up meat. It's more, I'm sorry if the framing has changed, my camera battery died. Her deciding to not eat meat is kind of a slipping into a state that's considered to be mental ill health by the people around her, but it's talking about the place of women in Korean society, and also the like strictness of Korean society and not being able to move outside the boundaries of what has been made for you. And I think that that's relevant outside of Korea as well. But I really loved this book. I loved the writing, and it took me until I was a third of the way through it for me to really get to that place, because the first third is from the point of view of this really insufferable character, and I didn't like the writing style of that part, but by the time I'd read the second part I realised that that was kind of intentional. The writing style was first person from this insufferable man, written in the way that that insufferable man would think, and so it was difficult to read. But when we moved into the second section, which is from the perspective of an artist and had some of the most beautiful imagery, like in a creepy, disturbing way, which is a thing that I love, like an Angela Carter or The Discomfort of Evening, things that are like uncomfortable and like really visceral. I really enjoy that, and I think that that was done really well in The Vegetarian. And it was so like stark on the page, which again is something that I love. Like it's not stark as in without description or without lyricism, but stark as in everything's just put very bluntly and clearly, and it's not dressed up in any way, and you're just allowed to interpret it, and I love that. And I think that it was a really well done book, and like it's not like an unheard of book. Everyone knows about The Vegetarian, but I really enjoyed it. Next on my list we have Still Life by Sarah Winman, and of course I read this because Simon from Savage Reads was raving about it for so long last year. It was one of his favourite books, and it ended up being one of my favourite books of last year as well. This is about Ulysses, who is a soldier at the end of the Second World War in Italy, and he meets this woman, whose name I can't remember, who is there looking at art, and the art that the Nazis have stolen and trying to get it back to where it's from. And she tells him he has to go to Florence, and when he does, he saves this man who's about to kill himself by jumping off a roof. And then he goes back to his East End home, and this sort of ragtag group of characters who are all very kind of quirky and odd, and it's a found family situation, and we see that his wife and the other people in this pub in the East End, and what it was like in late 1940s Britain after the Second World War, when there's still rationing and there's still real economic crisis, and particularly in this like deprived area of East London. But then one day the man that he saved dies and leaves him this flat in Florence, and so they all end up back in Florence. And we also see from the perspective of the woman that he met what her life was like after the war, and the ways that they kind of keep near missing each other. And it's just so wonderfully done. It's got so much heart and warmth, but without being saccharine or over the top. All of the characters are so wonderfully drawn. Despite being like quirky, they still feel like very real people. I spent a lot of my life working in pubs, and so that pub atmosphere felt really well drawn and really well realised. Ulysses himself, our main character, is just so wonderful, that his lack of judgment, and it's also got a lot of queerness involved in it, and a lot of talk about just art and beauty and family, and it's just so lovely, and it makes you want to go to Italy very much. So yeah, I absolutely love that book, and I know Lena Norms also loved that book. I think it was pretty popular last year, but I think it was just wonderful, and it's really nice to read a book that is literary and is good, but is also not dark and is not grim in any way. Another one that Simon Savage made me read last year is The Manningtree Witches by A.K. Blakemore, which I believe it won a prize, and this is a piece of historical fiction, as was Still Alive, but this time it's set in the 17th century during the English Civil War in a town in Essex, and it is about the witch trials that happened there, and the Witchfinder General, who was a real person. It is based on the real story of what happened in Essex at that time, and yeah, Simon from Savage Reads talked about it, and I think some other people did as well, but that's who I really remember talking about it, and I absolutely loved the writing style of this. I thought that it really evoked the time period without feeling like using language as a costume. It didn't feel like it felt real to the characters, and it felt lived in rather than feeling put on, and I really love it when historical fiction can do that, when it can really sort of emote the time period through the language that it's using without it becoming difficult to read or feeling like a gimmick. It felt very well done. It also really, like I've said about The Vegetarian, it really got into the kind of visceral, gritty dirtiness of the 17th century, of the prison, of just living in poverty, because the town that this exists, the town that these events happen in, is a poor rural community, and it is also during the English Civil War, when there was a lot of deprivation, a lot of lack of foodstuffs, and all the men being disappeared, not knowing where they were, and the main character is a woman and her daughter who live alone because the father is gone, and that makes them partly suspicious, women on their own. Wonderfully dark, without being over the top. It wasn't, not that I'm against a bit of camp, but this wasn't a camp book in any way. It was really, it felt very honest and slow, really slow moving, and really tense as well. I kept waiting for what was going to happen. I think potentially the ending was a little easy, which I don't always love, but aside from that, I did really enjoy the style in which it was written and the evocation of the time period. Next we have a big, chunky non-fiction book, and partly this is Empire of Pain by Radden Keefe, which partly I read because I was reading the Bally Gifford Prize shortlist last year, which I'll leave a vlog of linked in the cards above if you would like to go and see that. But also Hannah May really raved about this book as being one of her favourites from last year as well, and I can absolutely see why. I think it made it onto my favourites of last year list as well. It is a big, long, chunky piece of investigative journalism combined combined with like narrative history, which are two things that I really enjoy about the Sackler family, who were well, they still exist, but they were previously a kind of shady, unknown family whose name were on a lot of art galleries and museums, and charitable institutions were known to be from the Sackler family. But they made their money in opioids, beginning with Valium and moving into OxyContin. And this charts the story of this kind of, begins as the kind of rags to riches story of these three young Jewish Americans in the 1930s, and how they set up this business, and goes through various different forms. The book kind of mutates as it moves along. So we have this kind of rags to riches story about this one particularly charismatic man who's at the centre, the eldest brother, and then we move into kind of almost corporate thriller about the ways they're trying to amass money, the ways to try and get away with things, and they're being like chased by law enforcement, but the ways they're kind of obfuscating everything in the 1950s and 60s. And then we come up to this kind of courtroom drama, and we follow through the generations. So the first generations had this kind of slightly more like middle class into wealth upbringing, where they started off with not as much, and they did have to work very hard, and although they ended up being very ruthless people, there was some concept of reality. But their children, who have grown up rich always, their complete detachment from reality is kind of when the things start to go off the rails, and they kind of they continue to do even more and more outlandish things, thinking that they will never get caught. And in some ways they're right. It's an indictment of the American pharmaceutical industry, well, the global pharmaceutical industry, but particularly set in America, and of the law and justice system and the ways that having a lot of money can get you out of any situation. It is not a surprising story, because I think most of us were aware of that, but it is so meticulously well researched, and all of the characters, who are real life people, feel really well drawn and honest, and the ways that he uses information and interviews with various people and weaves them through into the story to build such a compelling case, I think is really well done. So other types of narrative non-fiction in a similar vein, like I read the Robert Maxwell book Fall along the same time, and it's a similar sort of idea, but it was much drier. It didn't have the intrigue that I think kept me going with Empire of Pain. The way that he built the story was so skillful. It wasn't just lists of facts and figures or segments that didn't feel connected. It really felt like a family epic saga. I haven't watched Succession, but I feel like it has a similar vibe to the way that people talk about that. So if you like that, I think you might like Empire of Pain. Next is a collection of short stories, but it's more the author really that Booktube got me to read. I've only read this one, but that is What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi. I had heard for years people talking about Helen Oyeyemi. I think Jean from Jean's Bookish Thoughts, Mercedes from Mercy's Bookish Musings, and Emma from Drinking by My Shelf, and Jen Campbell, I think, have all talked about Helen Oyeyemi. I've definitely heard lots of people talking about her books, and so last year I read What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours, which is a collection of her short stories, which are fairy tale-esque, I would say, and linked by themes of, or imagery of, flowers and keys. Some of them are clear, direct fairy tale retellings, like there's a Red Riding Hood retelling and a few Pinocchio retellings sprinkled throughout, and some either I don't know the fairy tales, or they have the same vibe as fairy tales, but they're not directly retellings. I just really loved the world that she built, and because what I've discovered that I do enjoy in short story collections is short story collections that are linked, and all of these short stories are in the same world, though not always in the same time period. They are wonderfully whimsical, but in a more dark way. They have kind of a grim underpinning, but a kind of floral beauty to them at the same time, and I really enjoyed that. I do love books that retell myths and fairy tales, although I've not read a Greek myth retelling I love in my life, so maybe I don't always love them, but I do enjoy things that have that element of magic that is spun in a slightly darker way. I like that a lot, and I think that she does it so well in these stories. There's so many layers to them, and there's kind of a wit to them as well, a kind of dark humour that underlies all of the stories, which is something that I really enjoy about them. Next on my list is Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward. This is another one that I've heard a lot of people talk about on Booktube, but I can't remember who specifically that I have taken it from, that I took the recommendation from, but it was a book that I read last year and I just loved it so much. This is about a small family, so we have Leonie and her son Jojo, and also she has a daughter as well, and they are driving from their grandparents' house to a prison where they are picking up the children's father who is just being released from prison. And that's kind of the basic plot of the book, but there are lots of things that kind of happen alongside this. So when they go to the prison, Jojo can see ghosts at the prison. See one ghost in particular who begins to tell the story of when Jojo's grandfather Rivers was incarcerated in the same place in the 1960s, I think, and how it's about drug addiction and about police brutality and the incarceration system as an extension of slavery, about family relationships and inherited trauma, and we discover what happened to Leonie's brother in the past, and lots of like past things come and unravel. Leonie is struggling with addiction during the course of the story, and the way that her parts of the story, the things from her perspective are written, is like prose poetry. There is a lot of, it's kind of very flowing in and out of lucidity and clarity, and so sometimes it feels like it gets a bit surreal and a bit strange and a bit stretched out. It's very slow moving, but wonderfully done. And then things from Jojo's perspective have more grounding to them, and him as a character is just so well built. You just feel so much for him because he is this, I think, 12-year-old boy, and how he looks after his little sister with so much care, and he's just a small child. And this book absolutely broke my heart and made me cry. It actually isn't that common for me. I don't cry that often at books, but this one definitely did. The language, like I said, is so incredibly beautiful, and you can really feel all of the setting. One that was really popular on Booktube when it came out in 2020 is The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. Although Emma Donoghue herself is another writer that I've heard a lot of people raving about a lot of her books. I have read 2 of them now, and I didn't love the one about the girl who doesn't eat. I didn't love that one, but The Pull of the Stars I really, really did. And I think Lauren in the Books was the one who was the most vocal about her love of that one and really got me to read it. It's set in 1918 in Dublin in a maternity hospital during the 1918 flu epidemic outbreak, or flu pandemic. And it is set on a maternity ward over the course of 3 days for women who have the flu whilst they are giving birth. And so there is a lot that happens. It's very full on. Our main character, Nurse Powers, is kind of left in sole charge of this maternity hospital because there is a doctor who comes in who is also a female doctor, and then there is also Birdie, who is kind of a skivvy, but she doesn't have any medical experience whatsoever, and it's about how they get these women through this time period, and also about the after effects of the war on Ireland, of the First World War on Ireland, with a lot of soldiers and the outcomes for them after having fought during the war, and also of the 1916 Easter Rising and how that is still having effects. Like the woman who is the doctor has some connection to the 1916 Easter Rising, and the sort of feeling of political tension, because as you know, the Civil War is going to start soon, so there's that feeling of political tension that pervades through it. There's a lot of like tension throughout the course of this book, and also it deals with the treatment of women and the medical history of the treatment of women, particularly in Ireland, and by the Catholic Church, and the treatment of children and the children of unwed mothers, or the residential schools and the Magdalen laundries, and those things come up as ideas throughout it. The abuse of women and children throughout Irish history, and it's so. The characters, again, one of the things I love about this is how well drawn and realised they feel, and I thought that it was so sad. Obviously it's dealing with a flu pandemic and maternal mortality, so there is a lot of blood and really vivid descriptions of medical treatments in a historical time period and a time of limited supplies as well. So there are some very, very graphic scenes that if you are a bit queasy about that, I would avoid this book. But I thought it was really wonderful and so moving. Again, I thought the ending was a little rushed, but aside from that, I really enjoyed it, and I thought the characters really came alive and I really felt for them. Another one that Jen Campbell made me read is Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo, and I'm really glad she did. The first book that I read by Bernardine Evaristo was Girl, Woman, Other, which obviously won the Booker Prize and is her most sort of well-known book, and I didn't really love it. I thought that all 12 perspectives had the exact same voice, and I don't like it when that happens, so I didn't really enjoy it for that reason, as well as the fat phobia that was throughout it. But I'm glad that I tried a different book by her, because I thought Mr. Loverman was wonderful. This is about Barrington, who is a man in his 70s who came to England from Antigua in the 1950s with his wife and started a family in, I think it's South London. I think they're in Streatham. I might be wrong, but I remember it as being Streatham. He is also a gay man, and he has been in a relationship with, I think his name's Curtis. It's been a while, might be something else, beginning with C, but they've been in a relationship since they were teenagers, and he's decided it's time to come out to his family. And we follow him over the course of a few days, I think, as he's considering this coming out to his family and what it would mean for his family. We also follow the perspective of his wife, who is a very religious woman, and they've had a very cantankerous relationship with a lot of anger, and Barrington is like such a misogynist. He never loved her and he never treated her well, and so we see her perspective of how their relationship began in Antigua, and this book is another one that had so much warmth and heart. It's a very funny book, and Barrington, from whom the majority of the perspective is definitely a raconteur. We love the way that I love the way that he tells the story of his life, and he has like this charm and wit, but at the same time you can still see all of his flaws and foibles, and I think that that's a really clever line to walk, that he is not a good person, but he is an interesting character, and the way that he treats other people and his selfishness and his relationships, I think it's a very like honest portrayal and an interesting portrayal of coming out at that time of life, and the culture of Caribbean Londoners, I think, is really well explored as well. And then the final one is again set in South London, about Caribbean British people, and that is Queenie by Candice Carty Williams. This was all over Booktube in 2019. I think, again, Lauren in the Books, I remember talking about it. I can't remember who else talked about it before I read it, but I remember lots of people talking about it, and I'm really glad I picked it up, because it looks quite like women's fiction, and I don't often read women's fiction, and it does follow a lot of the similar beats and ideas of female friendship, of female sexuality, but it is much more interesting and deeper than a lot of the other women's fiction that I have been exposed to. I'm sure that there are other women's fiction that is similarly deep, but it's not the stereotype of women's fiction. It's a really interesting book. So it's about Queenie, who is in her mid-20s, living in London with a job she doesn't love, and she is coming to terms with her childhood trauma and her family and her own mental health struggles. She experiences a breakup at the very beginning of the book, and it kind of causes her to spiral. And we see her relationships with her friends, with her family, and with men, and the way that she uses sex as a form of self-harm in the book. And it just felt so open and so relatable and so vulnerable and raw, and I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. Tackled head on some quite dark topics, and it really went there. The complex relationships of family trauma and of coming to understand yourself whilst dealing with the ways that the world has like shut you down, and it deals with like racism in London and her experiences growing up, and how those things interact, how that interacts with dating. As a black woman in England, I thought that that was a very good and interesting angle explored. I also love that it's set in Brixton, which is like 15 minutes down the road from where I grew up, and they go to like the Crystal Palace fireworks, and I grew up in Crystal Palace. It integrates like text message conversations and like chats over work messenger and stuff, and I think it does that in a good way, because again that can feel really, really gimmicky, and I think that the voice was really strong, which was something that I loved about it. So there you go, those are 10 books that I loved that Booktube made me read. Please let me know in the comments down below any books that Booktube has made you read that you've enjoyed, or any books that I've made you read that you've enjoyed. I would love to hear that. If I have ever made you pick up a book that you perhaps wouldn't have without the encouragement, I would love to hear that. Please remember to like this video if you liked it, and to subscribe. I put out new videos twice a week, so I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!